At some point in his financial life, every man realizes something deeply uncomfortable. He's no longer just fighting to earn money. He's fighting to make the money he's already earned start changing the game. Because the difference between a man who depends entirely on his own work to improve his life and a man who has already built a financial foundation that can grow alongside him can be brutal. And that difference doesn't necessarily show up in the car he drives, the house he lives in, or the salary he earns. Sometimes two men can have lives that look almost identical from the outside, but behind the numbers, one of them is building a position that gives him more and more options, while the other remains completely dependent on his next paycheck. And this is where most people make a mistake. They look at wealth as if there's only one final destination, becoming rich. But the truth is, there are specific points along that journey where the relationship between you, your money, and your future begins to change in a much more significant way. These are moments when the money you've already managed to build stops being just a reserve and starts becoming a real financial force. Some numbers might even look ordinary when you see them on their own, until you understand what they actually represent. And today I'm going to show you the 3 net worth milestones that can completely change the way you see building wealth. And more importantly, what you need to do to reach them and make your money start working on your side. When a man decides to build wealth, there's one particularly challenging part that almost nobody talks about: the beginning. You work, get your paycheck, pay your bills, and you still try to set some money aside to build something for the future. But then you look at your balance and think, is that it? You've been putting money in for months. You've made sacrifices. Maybe you've even gone without buying some of the things you wanted. And yet when you look at your net worth, the change seems way too small compared to all the effort you're putting in. That feeling can be especially frustrating for a man who's trying to take his finances seriously. Because in the beginning, it feels like you're doing almost all the work yourself, and honestly, it's frustrating to put in so much effort and see so little in return. So it's easy to start thinking, am I really making progress? Is it actually worth continuing? Maybe I need to make a lot more money before investing will really make a difference. And this is exactly where many of us get the beginning wrong. During the first few years, there's a huge difference between what you're putting into your wealth and what your wealth itself is capable of producing. When your invested capital is still small, even a good percentage return translates into a relatively small amount of money. If you have a small amount invested, the returns will start small too. So in the beginning, most of the growth you see comes directly from your own contributions. It's almost like hiring an employee on their first day. You know that person could become incredibly valuable over time, but at that first moment, they haven't produced much yet. Your wealth works in a similar way. In the beginning, you're doing far more for your money than your money is doing for you. But slow growth doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong. It simply means you're still in the stage of the journey where your own contributions represent most of the results. And the biggest problem here is that this phase can really test your patience, because nobody likes working for years without feeling like they're getting anywhere. And that's exactly when some people walk away from the process. They look at the size of their wealth today and use that number to decide whether it's worth continuing. But there's a change happening behind the scenes that isn't quite as easy to see yet. The money you're accumulating is no longer just sitting there waiting for your next deposit. It's also starting to participate in the growth. And as your wealth grows, that contribution grows as well. That's why the wealth building journey can be so misleading in the beginning. For a certain period of time, it feels like almost nothing is happening. And then, at some point, the relationship between what you put in and what your own wealth is capable of producing begins to change. That raises a much more interesting question. If the beginning is really this slow, is there a certain level of wealth where the experience starts to change? Is there a number where you stop feeling like you're simply accumulating money and start noticing that your capital is gaining momentum on its own? And the answer might be even more surprising than you think. Because when we talk about wealth, almost everyone immediately thinks of one number, $1 million. But that number is nowhere near the first number that truly matters. And I'm going to explain why. Having $1 million invested or accumulated is a substantial amount of wealth, and it can represent a major change in someone's financial life. That's undeniable. The problem starts when you turn that number into the only goal that matters. Because if you believe you're only making real progress once you reach $1 million, there's a good chance you'll spend years looking at your net worth and feeling like you're still nowhere close. Imagine having $50,000, then $100,000, then $200,000. For someone starting from zero, each of those milestones represents a huge difference. But when you compare any of them to $1 million, they all seem small. And that comparison can completely distort the way you see your own progress. It's like looking at a 3,000-mile journey and deciding that the first 300 miles don't mean anything because you still have another 2,700 to go. You have to understand that the wealth building journey doesn't feel the same at every level. The first few $1,000s can feel incredibly slow. Your wealth grows gradually, but as your net worth increases, something starts to change. The same percentage growth that once represented a few $100s can later represent thousands, and eventually tens of thousands. A larger pool of wealth can generate larger results simply because there's more capital working for you. That's exactly why certain financial milestones matter so much, not because they're magical numbers, but because at certain points, the math starts to change the experience of the person building wealth. And before we talk about what those three milestones are, we need to briefly understand what's happening behind them. Because there's a very powerful force working on your wealth, and that force is what explains why these milestones exist. That force is nothing more than compound interest. Let me explain how it works with a practical example. If you have $100 invested and earn a certain return, your wealth now consists of the $100 you originally invested plus whatever the investment earned. So far, nothing too impressive. The difference starts becoming noticeable in the period that follows. The money you earned previously remains invested. So when the next return comes in, it's no longer working only on the $100 you originally put in. It's also working on the growth that has already taken place. That's where the math starts to come into play. In the beginning, almost all of the momentum comes from you. But after a certain point, everything starts to develop a momentum of its own. That's why the three wealth milestones we're about to look at shouldn't be treated as magic numbers. There's no rule saying that once you reach a certain amount, your financial life suddenly changes overnight. What actually changes is the scale. As your wealth grows, the same percentage return starts representing increasingly larger amounts of money. As a result, what once required years of contributions can eventually be influenced much more significantly by the capital you've already built. And the first major turning point in a man's financial life comes when he reaches his first $10,000. For many people, that might seem like a small number. After all, we're talking about net worth, and when it comes to wealth, we usually think in terms of hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. But there's a reason the first $10,000 matter so much. They represent far more than the number sitting in your account. Reaching your first $10,000 means you've managed to do something that sounds simple, but actually requires a lot of discipline. You had to build capital. You had to resist certain temptations to spend. And most importantly, you had to turn investing into a behavior you could consistently repeat. That's why this financial milestone works almost like a test, not just of whether you have money invested, but whether you've developed the behavior necessary to build wealth. Think about it. Anyone can receive an unexpected amount of money and put it into an account. But consistently building wealth is different. You keep making the same financial decisions even when the results aren't impressive yet. And you learn to let time work in your favor. This milestone represents a much bigger psychological shift than the number itself might suggest. But now, let's put it into numbers. Imagine a man who starts investing $100 a month and earns an average return of 8% per year. At that pace, he would reach approximately $10,000 in about 6.5 years. But there's something important you can do to reach that first milestone faster. You don't necessarily have to reach $10,000 by simply increasing the amount coming out of your own paycheck. Depending on your situation, there are tools that can help. A workplace retirement plan, for example, may allow part of your income to be automatically directed toward retirement. In some cases, there may also be tax benefits that reduce the tax impact of your contributions. And when an employer offers an employer match, part of the money you invest may be matched by an additional contribution from the company itself, depending on the rules of the plan. There may also be opportunities to make additional contributions when your income increases or when you receive extra money. The point here isn't to memorize all of these possibilities. It's to understand that building your first $10,000 doesn't have to depend entirely on working more hours or simply cutting every little expense out of your life. You can also use the tools available to you to increase the speed at which you build capital. And that brings us to the true meaning of this first milestone. $10,000 doesn't mean you're rich, that you can stop working, or that your financial problems have suddenly disappeared, but it represents something much more important at this stage of the journey. It proves that you can build wealth. You've moved beyond simply thinking about investing and reached the point where you have real capital working in your favor. And maybe for the first time, you can look at your net worth and think, I can do this. That's the first mental barrier breaking. After your first $10,000, the goal no longer feels completely abstract. You've already built something. Now you need to find out what happens when that foundation becomes much larger, because there's a huge difference between proving that you can build capital and reaching the point where that capital itself starts generating an amount of money you can actually feel. And that's exactly what happens at the next milestone. When you reach this second level, your first $100,000, that's when the math starts to get really interesting. And there's an incredibly simple way to understand it. Imagine you have $100 invested and earn a 10% return. 10% of $100 is just $10? Now imagine that exact same rate of return applied to $100,000. 10% of $100,000 is $10,000. The rate didn't change, the investment didn't necessarily become more efficient. What changed was the amount of capital working for you. And that's one of the most important ideas in this entire journey. The math is the same, but the scale is completely different. And that brings us to one of the biggest advantages of having capital. There's a physical limit to how much a man can produce using only his own time. You only have 24 hours in a day. You can work more hours. You can get a better job. You can negotiate a higher salary. But eventually, there's a limit. You can't sell infinitely more hours of your life. Capital works differently. A dollar invested doesn't need another hour of your day to keep participating in the growth. $100,000 can remain invested while you work, sleep, travel, or spend time with your family. Of course, that doesn't mean capital will always grow. Investments carry risk, returns fluctuate, and there's no guaranteed rate of growth. But from a long-term perspective, the difference becomes very clear between relying entirely on your own labor and having a base of capital that can also generate returns. The larger that base becomes, the greater the financial impact of the same rate of growth can be. Imagine a man who reaches $100,000 at age 35. Now, just to understand the power of the math, imagine he makes no additional contributions and his wealth grows at an average of 8% per year. By age 65, 30 years later, that $100,000 could grow into a little over $1 million. And if he left the money invested for another 10 years until age 75, his wealth could grow to more than $2 million. All without adding a single dollar after age 35 in this example. We know there will be good years, there will be bad years, there will be periods of decline, and there will also be taxes, fees, and other factors that can affect the final result. But the point of this example isn't to predict exactly how much you'll have in the future. It's to show what can happen when a significant amount of capital is given decades to grow. And this is where a concept you may have heard of comes in: coast fire. The idea is relatively simple. After accumulating enough wealth relatively early, you may reach a point where you no longer need to make large contributions to reach a certain retirement goal in the future. Your existing capital can continue growing over time. That can allow someone to slow down the pace of accumulation and put more energy into other areas of life. But it's important not to interpret this the wrong way. It doesn't mean that every man who reaches $100,000 at age 35 can simply stop investing and retire. The outcome depends on factors such as age, expenses, retirement goals, investment returns, inflation, and many other variables. The real point is something else. It's to show that after $100,000, a new dynamic starts to emerge. Capital, growth, more capital. The wealth you've built starts representing an increasingly significant portion of your total growth. And that's a huge psychological shift, because you no longer feel like all of your growth depends entirely on how much money you can put into the market that month. Now you have a base of capital that's also participating in the process. And if $100,000 can already change the relationship between your effort and your wealth this much, there's an even more interesting number. A milestone that most people simply overlook when they talk about wealth: $500,000. Now we've reached the third milestone, and this might be the most surprising number in the entire journey. When most people think about building wealth, they usually picture a very simple progression: $10,000, $100,000, then $1 million, as if $100,000 were simply a stop along the way to $1 million. But between those two numbers is a milestone that deserves much more attention: $500,000. And the reason isn't simply because $500,000 is a larger amount. It's because at this level of wealth, money starts to represent something that goes far beyond the growth of your account. It starts to represent options. But before we talk about freedom, we need to understand what happens to the math. Think about a net worth of $500,000. Now imagine, just as a mathematical example, an average return of 8% per year. 8% of $500,000 is $40,000 in 1 year. Read that number again: $40,000. That doesn't mean you're going to receive $40,000 every year as a guarantee. As I've already explained, investments don't work that way. Returns fluctuate, but this example shows something extremely important. When you have a capital base of $500,000, even a relatively ordinary percentage change starts representing an amount of money that can be truly significant. We're no longer talking about just a few $100s. We're talking about tens of thousands. And that changes the relationship between a man and his wealth. Because when you have very little capital, your work is responsible for practically all of your financial growth. But when you reach a much larger capital base, your money starts representing a financial force that you can actually feel. And when you reach this milestone, you can start buying something that may be even more valuable than simply buying things. You can start buying options. Imagine, for example, that you have a job that pays very well, but is consuming almost all of your energy. Without significant wealth, you may feel like you have no choice. You need that paycheck. You need to stay in that job. Now imagine you have a financial base of $500,000. Maybe that allows you to reduce your workload. Maybe you can work fewer hours. Maybe you can take a position that pays less but gives you a much better quality of life. Or maybe you simply have the financial flexibility to say no to a professional situation you would have been forced to accept before. And that difference is enormous. Money stops being just a way to buy things and starts buying you room to make decisions. And that flexibility can completely change the way a man sees his own life. Wealth doesn't necessarily eliminate problems. It increases the number of choices you have for dealing with them. And maybe that's one of the most interesting ways to look at wealth. You can buy a car, you can buy a house, you can buy things. But one of the most valuable things wealth can buy is flexibility. Flexibility to change direction. Flexibility to get through a difficult period without immediately falling into a financial crisis. And that's why $500,000 can be considered a true freedom milestone. Because depending on your situation, your cost of living, your age, and your goals, having a significant amount of wealth can start creating a margin that simply didn't exist before. And that margin can be incredibly valuable. Of course, all of this needs to be put into perspective. $500,000 can mean completely different things to different people. So the goal isn't to say that this amount is enough for anyone to stop working. The goal is to show that at a certain level of wealth, money starts doing something much more interesting than simply growing. It starts creating space, and that space can allow you to make decisions based on what you actually want, rather than making every decision solely based on what you need to do to pay the bills. That's the real transformation. In the first few $1,000s, you're trying to build security. At $100,000, your capital starts gaining scale. At $500,000, depending on your circumstances, your wealth can start giving you freedom of choice. When you look at each wealth milestone separately, they seem like just three completely different numbers. But there's something that connects all three. In reality, they represent three stages of the same transformation. The first $10,000 represent discipline. It's the moment when you prove to yourself that you can build capital. You've learned to control a portion of what you earn, resist certain spending temptations, stay consistent, and turn investing into something that's part of your routine. Then come the first $100,000. Here, the main change is acceleration. Your wealth has grown enough for investment returns to start representing much more noticeable amounts of money. You're still contributing, but now there's a second force working alongside you, the capital you've already accumulated. And then we reach $500,000. This is the point where your wealth starts representing something beyond financial growth. It starts giving you options, more flexibility in where you work, how much you work, and which situations you're willing to accept. It doesn't mean you can simply stop working, but it does mean your financial situation may start giving you something very few people have in abundance: room to choose. There's no secret formula for reaching $100,000. There's no special investment you need once you reach $500,000. And you don't need to learn a completely different strategy every time you reach a new milestone. The behavior that builds your first $10,000 is essentially the same behavior that can take you to $100,000 and eventually $500,000. You start, you contribute, you stay consistent. You resist the temptation to abandon the process, and you give your wealth time to grow. That's exactly why the real enemy isn't a lack of financial knowledge. It's impatience. Early growth can be so slow that you start believing it isn't working. You think the progress should be faster and bigger, but there's a problem with that conclusion. You may be giving up right before you reach the point where the math starts becoming more favorable. So if you're just getting started, maybe the question shouldn't be, how long will it take me to get rich? Maybe it should be, what can I start building today that my future self will be grateful I kept going with? Start. Use time to your advantage. And whenever they're available to you, take advantage of tools that can help accelerate the process, such as workplace retirement plans, employer matching, and tax benefits. But above all, don't abandon the process simply because the first few years feel slow. Because $10,000 isn't just $10,000. $100,000 isn't just $100,000. And $500,000 isn't just $500,000. Each milestone represents a change in the relationship between you, your money, and time. And maybe that's the real reason these numbers matter. At the end of the day, building wealth isn't just about reaching a certain number. It's about reaching the point where your decisions are no longer driven entirely by how much money you need to make or what you can afford to buy today. The real payoff comes when you realize that what you've built is starting to expand what's possible in your life, and that wealth in the deepest sense means having more control over your own future. If this video made you look at your financial life differently, let me know in the comments. Which of these three milestones is your biggest goal right now? And if you want to keep learning about money, wealth building, and financial decisions for men who want to build a stronger, more secure life, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.